Hello, I'm Peter Bentley, Research Fellow at the L.H. Martin Institute. Today I'm talking with Emeritus Professor Steven Schwartz. He is currently the Board Chair of ACARA, the Australian Curriculum Assessment and Reporting Authority. Previously he was Vice-Chancellor of Murdoch University and Macquarie Universities here in Australia and Brunel University in the UK. Welcome, Steven, and thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
It's a pleasure to be here.
Australia has a unified national system of universities, predominantly public, comprehensive universities with combined research and teaching missions. What scope is there within this system for mission differentiation?
It's a good question, and it's one that you can imagine occupies the minds of university vice-chancellors and staff all the time. It's very difficult to come up with a very different and if you were to read the mission and vision statements of Australian universities, you'd be hard-pressed to find much difference within them. That's not to say that there aren't differences among universities. There are some that are much more research-intensive than others, but they're kept into a kind of mold by the accreditation system, and that makes it harder for them to really branch out and do something ridiculously and radically different because the rules don't allow it. And I find that it's probably occupying more time than it's worth to try to figure out what your individual mission is. It's better, I think, to just try to do the best you can with what you've got.
So what would be the main barriers if you are looking at how to do the best with the resources you've got? What are the barriers to utilising those resources to their full potential?
Look, I actually think there are some barriers that if we removed would make for a lot more differentiated system. And those barriers largely lie around the traditional accreditation regulation system. They're based on how much time a student puts into a degree, the inputs that go in from the university, so how big is the library, how well are the labs equipped, and so on. If that were able to be swapped to outcomes rather than to inputs, so that what we were really looking at in an institution was how well they train or teach students for the roles that they're going to have. And we looked at outputs, graduation scores, what happens to students after they graduate, rather than inputs. You'd have a lot more room for universities to use online teaching, to use new methodologies, to take experimental approaches if we looked at what was the product of it rather than what goes into it. As long as we keep focusing our rules about what goes into it, we're not going to have tremendous amount of variation from where we are now.
But isn't the regulatory system predominantly threshold standards whereby people are free to exceed? They can have a larger library or they could have a smaller library should they choose to?
They can have a larger one. I'm not sure they can have a smaller one because there are standards. But I guess it's the whole mentality. If you're, for example, wanting to have an entirely online university with an online degree, things like student-staff ratios and libraries become less relevant and really outcomes become much more important. And I would like to see us focus a lot more on outcomes and products of universities and a lot less on inputs.
Now, you are currently a Fellow of the Centre for Independent Studies, a think tank with a free market, limited government agenda. What role do you see for government in a higher education system?
Well, I think we do have to have a role of government in a higher education system, and if there were ever any doubt about it, some of the recent developments in the vocational education area in Australia would convince even the most hardened free market campaigner that if government subsidies are involved, then we need to be careful about how they're used and how they're allocated, and there needs to be a system of regulation. So I'm not in any way suggesting that there shouldn't be regulation for higher education. It just seems inevitable that the system will be, that great word, rorted. If a system can be gamed, it will be gamed, and so there needs to be some controls around it. You wouldn't hope, though, that they weren't so restrictive and constraining that they kept innovation at bay and that they kept everyone looking exactly alike.
So your argument would be the extent of regulation rather than the existence of it?
If by extent you mean what's regulated, then yes, I think there are some things that need to be regulated, and in the higher education space, it's obviously like things, for example, like admission standards. It's now come to light, and we're aware that there have been organizations that have admitting students to courses for which the students are not prepared and unable to really make use of. So regulation of admission standards, making sure that people are honest about what they're doing when they bring people in, maybe informed consent for students about what their opportunities really are going to be if they do this course, lack of incentives so that students aren't duped into taking courses. All of those things, I think, are legitimate areas for government regulation.
What about fee deregulation or regulation of fees?
Yeah, well, that one's a bit trickier. I know I should say yes to that because most of the time regulation halts innovation and deregulation makes the market work better. And I know most of the universities are now in favor of deregulation. But I still get a bit worried about very high cost courses admitting students who may not be able to finish it and who then aren't able to repay their government loans. And those costs can go up very quickly. About a quarter of the current outstanding help loans are never expected to be repaid. If we take in lots of students who aren't capable of doing their course, that number could grow rather rapidly. In the UK, with a very similar system to ours, that's approaching 50p in a pound not being repaid. That's quite a big amount of money. So while I sort of philosophically think deregulation makes sense, it will need to be very carefully implemented if it's not going to be extremely costly to the taxpayer.
So there is a role for government in the regulation of which students are able to enter higher education and how much universities could potentially charge them for studying.
Yeah, I think so. I think that price ceilings in general don't work in the economy, but in this particular area of the economy, the world's quite different. Price signals seem to mean the opposite things. In the UK, when they raised the fees to £9,000, a few universities didn't. And they lost students because it was almost as if people were looking at the fee as a kind of proxy for the quality of the course. And so it actually backfired. So you don't have a normal market here, and prices and things don't work in the way you would expect them to work if you were selling some other product.
So at a system level, can you think of any successful examples around the world where they've got the balance between regulation and marketisation about right?
Probably we do, really. Because we're thinking about it for a moment, that we have a fairly free market in international students. Australian universities are heavily dependent on international students when compared to international universities. We have a very high percentage of them. There's no regulation on the fees that they can be charged, and these universities compete quite heavily for the international students to come to their universities. They pay commissions to agents to send these students to them. So there's a serious market in international students going on in Australia right now with very little regulation from the government other than around visas. And it seems to be successful. I think most Australian universities wouldn't be able to survive now without the income and the revenue brought to them by international students.
So marketisation works, but that's
it
works in an area where there's no public funding supporting these students.
That's right. There are no subsidies.
So when there is public funding, there ought to be some strings attached.
I agree. I do. I agree with that. I think if the public is being asked to fund something, then they should feel relaxed that that funding is being used for what it's supposed to be used for and in an efficient and proper way. But at universities, people at university don't like to be thought of as businesses. Our aims are much more noble than just making a profit, right? We're there to enable social mobility and people with the talents to move up. We're there to do research and discover new things. We're there to train tomorrow's leaders and all that. And all of that is true. But universities at the bottom are businesses. They use equipment and they consume supplies and they employ labor to produce services and goods that they sell at a price. And the costs that are involved in producing those things constrain what they offer and how good it is. If their revenues are higher from one course than another, they will move to offer that course. And if they don't have enough revenue to pay the cost, they go bankrupt. It's hard to see the differences between a university and another business. They're non-profit. They don't pay dividends to shareholders. They reinvest back in the business, but they also give it to their staff and so on. Making no profit doesn't mean that people don't actually benefit.
Yes, but no university has gone bankrupt, have they?
No university's gone bankrupt, but it doesn't mean it's not possible.
Yes, but perhaps there are politics at play where certain regions need a university.
Universities have, by the way, I should correct that. I think some universities, or colleges at least, have gone bankrupt in the USA, where I guess there are a very large number of private institutions that are not subsidized. I heard the regional argument quite a lot, and if it's a true argument, you should be able to find the data to prove that, but that it would be better to have students studying in the country because they'll stay in the country. But whether that actually happens or not, I don't really know the answer to that.
So overall, what do you see as the main challenges facing higher education, perhaps in Australia or perhaps globally?
If you asked me that while I was still working as a Vice-Chancellor, I would give the answer I think most of my colleagues would, which is it's all about the money. And I know when you read the higher education press here in Australia, it tends to focus quite a lot on the funding and where it's coming from and are there going to be cuts and so on. But I actually think the major issue is more of a crisis of identity. That I think higher education is going to have to deal with, because with the proliferation of online learning and networking, with the new jobs and the kind of disappearance of the old jobs, with the different patterns of people's lives, people are becoming older when they go to university, more career-oriented, and the old sort of liberal arts, let's go to university and explore the universe, is going to be harder and harder to maintain in a much more practically orientated future. And so I would have thought the real challenge is how do we keep what's good in the past about universities, the things that we all liked and attracted us to it, in an area where maybe the value of those things is not going to be as high as it once was. And I think maintaining the integrity of the university might be the biggest challenge.
Well, thank you very much, Stephen. It's been a pleasure having you at the LH Martin Institute.
Oh, thank you, Peter. It's been my pleasure as well.